Hello again. Let me continue with the second section of the class and the second section of Marxist criticism, Marxist literary criticism in general. In fact, although Marx and Engels didn't put forward a comprehensive theory of literature, their views relaxed and undogmatic. Good art always has a degree of freedom from prevailing economic circumstances, even if these economic facts are its ultimate determinant. So the art is a result of economic circumstances according to them. And even though that art is determined by the economic base, what kind of production relationships you have and what kind of art that they create are a result of the base and superstructure relationship. And even though they negatively criticize this kind of relationship, they welcomed art and artistic products. And thus Engels, writing to the English novelist Margaret Harkness in April 1888, tells her that he is far from finding fault with you for not having written a point-blank socialist novel. So in their idea, especially in the early years of the Soviet Union, Leninist Marxism argued that literature had to be socialist realist and it had to serve the purposes of the party, Communist Party. Marxist literary criticism maintains that a writer's social class and the ideology of the writer's social class have a major bearing on what is written by a member of that class. So the ideology of the social class definitely reflects the ideology of the author. So if the author comes from the aristocracy, and the novel or any literary text that he or she is writing definitely and inevitably reflects the ideology of that class which the author is a member of. So instead of seeing authors as primarily autonomous, inspired individuals whose genius and creative imagination enables them to bring forth original and timeless works of art, the Marxist sees them as constantly formed by their social contexts in ways which they themselves would usually not admit. The writers may refuse their social class and the understanding of and the ideology and understanding of their culture, their class, but however, they are inevitably reflected in that. Okay, the next paragraph and the next page. However, it is probably true to say that traditional Marxist criticism tends to deal with history in a fairly generalized way. It talks about conflicts between social classes and clashes of large historical forces, but contrary to popular belief, it rarely discusses the detail of a specific historical situation and relates it closely to the interpretation of a particular literary text. As Newton implies, this suggests one of the main differences between the Marxist criticism of the 1960s and 70s and the cultural materialist and neo-historicist criticism which came to the fore in the 1980s, since the latter very often dealt closely with specific historical documents, attempting in an almost archaeological spirit to recreate the state of mind of a particular moment in history. Now, in Marxist criticism then, instead of writing about a specific moment in history, instead of writing a story of a period in somebody's lifetime, Marxist criticism believes that the text always reflects the class. The text always reflects the class distinctions and the class relations in a society, the characters' class relations in that text. How about Leninist criticism then? A much harder line about literature than Marx and Engels themselves would have approved of was generally pursued by officially sanctioned Marxists. So, Leninist Marxism or Leninist criticism was basically a Soviet one. In the 1930s saw reaction throughout the whole Soviet society, and the state began to erect direct control over literature and the arts as well as everything else. At the first Soviet Writers' Congress in 1934, liberal views were outlawed and a new orthodoxy imposed, based on the writings of Lenin rather than those of Marx and Engels. Lenin had argued in 1905 that literature must become an instrument of the party. Literature, he said, must become party literature. It must become part of the organized, methodical, unified labors of the Social Democratic Party. So, literature must serve the purposes of the party. Literature must serve the victory of the proletariat, according to Lenin. And Maxim Gorky, for example, famous Maxim Gorky, perhaps you may know Maxim Gorky. Maxim Gorky wrote such kind of fiction. In all the works of Maxim Gorky, the good people were extremely good because they were all poor. Poor people were unconditionally good people, and rich people were unconditionally bad people, and they exploited the poor. And it was such an understanding that it was called socialist realism, and socialist realism suggested that lower classes are described as always suffering all the time, and they are unconditionally composed of very good people, very good-hearted people. And the aristocracy and bourgeois were composed of very bad people all the time, evil-hearted people all the time, because their sole purpose is to maintain their own goods, their own wealth, and their only purpose is to exploit the people of the lower classes. And what about Engelsian Marxist criticism? Friedrich Engels, what did he say about literature? From the 1930s, however, a rich variety of Steiner calls Engelsian Marxist criticism flourished, either in exile or in suppressed and underground form. The group now called the Russian formalists had flourished in the 1920s until disbanded by the party. I talked about these Russian formalists when we were talking about new criticism, as you may remember, because I said that Trotsky sent them to exile. They had to leave the country because the Russian formalists were trying to analyze the party language. And analyzing the party language was something dangerous, and the party didn't want this. So they had to leave the country and spent the rest of their lives in exile, mostly in Germany and Czechoslovakia back then, which is Czech Republic now, or Czechia. They went to Prague. Okay, the most prominent members of the group were Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Tomaszewski, Boris Eichenbaum, whose work can be sampled in Russian formalist criticism. Their ideas included the need for close formal analysis of literature, has its own characteristic producers and effects, and is not just a version of ordinary language. And Shklovsky's idea of defamiliarization or making strange. Like in neo-criticism, we talked about, defamiliarization, making things strange, making things alienated. In reification, there's also defamiliarization, because when something is reified, you defamiliarize that concept inevitably. So, their analysis, I'm sorry, I missed, all right, now I found where I am. Sorry. Another key formalist idea is Tomaszewski's distinction. Distinction between story and plot. The former being a sequence of events as they should have occurred, while the latter is the artistic presentation of those events. So, the sequence, story, is what happens in life, but the plot is the creation of the author. So plot is something artistic. You create the plot. Okay? But event is there. That's the story itself. It is there. For instance, an accident that you watch from your window is a story to tell. But the way you tell it is a new construct. It's a new form. It is your own plot. At which part of the story you begin telling? I was sitting on the balcony having my tea in the late afternoon. Suddenly I heard a crash. Then your story begins. This is your plot. It's not how the story happened. There's no relationship with your having tea in the balcony. So the story and the plot are different things. Story is the sequence taken out from life. Plot is your artistic production. Now, as with the concept of defamiliarization, there's a careful distinction here between reality itself and its verbal representation in a work of literature, so that we are steered away from any notion that literature simply mirrors reality in a documentary way. It doesn't have to all the time. It doesn't have to reflect the reality in a documentary way. But Marxist critics thought that, defended that idea. Some of those associated with formalism, like Mikhail Bakhtin, remained in Russia. But others went into exile and continued their work abroad, thus sowing the seeds of the new forms of Marxist criticism which emerged in 1960s. Okay, now we go back to post-structuralism once again. As always, as I always said all the time, structuralism was a very influential literary form. And after structuralism, everything changed. And after post-structuralism, nothing was the same ever again. So, even Marxist criticism as a literary theory, you see, I'm not saying Marxism itself. Marxism itself had been there already for more than 100 years, but not Marxist literary criticism. Marxist literary criticism began to be talked about and began to be practiced in 1960s. After structuralism occurred in 1950s. Can you imagine? And after, post-structuralism, of course, helped Marxist criticism grow. One such exile was the linguist Roman Jakobson, who continued his work in Prague, founding the Prague Linguistic Circle, the members of which included René Wellek. Wellek, like Jakobson, went to America shortly before the start of the war and was influential in a movement known as New Criticism, the one we talked about. The suppressed Russian formalists also had an influence in Germany on the Frankfurt School of Marxist aesthetics. Frankfurt School is very famous in Marxist aesthetics, Marxist literary theory. And then in 1960s, Theodor Adorno came into being. also forced to flee from Germany was the playwright Bertolt Brecht. Okay, his notion of the alienation effect, Bertolt Brecht's most famous theory was the alienation effect in theater, which he called the epic theater, which was against the unseen curtain between the audience and the actors on stage. Additionally, in drama, involves devices which draw attention of the audience to the fact that what they see on the stage is a constructed literary image, not a natural reality. Okay, so far we have seen that Marxist criticism, Marxist theory in general, politically, is something that defines the capitalist system very well, because it analyzed the added value, excess value, profit very well. And this analysis of the profit and the excess value was a very important innovational theory in the analysis of the present capitalist system. And in this present capitalist system, which is based on exploitation, we consume all the time, and there is reification all the time in the societies, and this reification alienates people in the societies. And within this alienation, the texts written by the members of members of the class system within this capitalist society are always the reflections of the class relationships. So whatever we read, whatever we watch, and whatever we see around us, we can always analyze them according to the class distinctions of the society. Okay, now I'm closing this session now, and I'm going to start the second session in about 5 minutes, the third session in about 5 minutes again. See you in 5 minutes.